A new report detailing an unknown drone fleet entering U.S. military airspace has been released. Late last year, a fleet of drones breached restricted airspace at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia for over 2 weeks. NewsNation Washington, D.C. correspondent Joe Khalil joins us with more insight into the report. Joe, the first drone spotted was roughly 20 feet long and flying at more than 100 miles per hour. What do we know about the drones that were seen over the 17-day period that were detailed in this report?
Yeah, Drew, we now know a little bit more about how the military and how the DoD is investigating that incident. We don't know exactly what these things were. The Pentagon has not come forward and definitively said that. If they know what these things are at all, they're certainly not sharing that publicly. But what we can now report is that AARO, the division within the Pentagon that investigates UFOs, UAPs, and other what they call anomalous phenomenon, things we can't easily explain, AARO was alongside the FBI and the DoD in investigating what exactly these lights and these drones were. Now, there is still speculation that these could have been an adversary, someone like China or Russia or someone else, potentially a terrorist organization, doing reconnaissance, trying to spy over the base. Now, remember that Langley is home to some of our most advanced fighter jets. It's also home to some of our largest military infrastructure that we have anywhere in the country. So obviously, whatever these things are, they are very serious, and these are sensitive areas. So the U.S. military taking all of it very seriously. A new Wall Street Journal report quotes senior military commanders as saying that these drones themselves, whatever they were, these vehicles, were about 20 feet long, that they flew at over 100 miles an hour and at about 3,000 to 4,000 feet above the ground. That seems to corroborate witnesses that came forward exclusively to NewsNation. When we reported this very early on, people saying that they had seen these things, these lights, doing very strange maneuvers in the sky, and they thought that they were about the size of cars or vehicles. So at least that does seem to jive with what, again, we have been hearing as we now get this new reporting from the Wall Street Journal.
Now, late last year, a suspected Chinese spy balloon floated across the U.S. for 8 days. Is there a theory that these drones could be some similar spying to that?
Yeah, that's right. And the speculation that this could be potentially Chinese spying efforts. Also add in the fact there that there was a person, 26-year-old Chinese national, who was arrested nearby the base in January, just a couple of weeks after this happened, for flying a drone over protected airspace. Now, we don't want to draw any conclusions from that because the drone that this young man was flying had actually been purchased at Costco. It was a commercial drone. It wasn't nearly as big as what some of the witnesses had observed in December of 2023 flying over Langley. But there is speculation. That's certainly a possibility that can't be taken off the table. In fact, I've talked to a number of U.S. senators who, when they were forced to guess or put forward their best hypothesis, said they suspect it could be Chinese spying efforts. We just don't know that definitively. And one counterpoint to that might be the fact that these things were out in the open. You see the video, you see the lights. Typically, when a foreign adversary tries to spy on another, they don't make it so obvious. But again, in this case, these were in plain sight, as was that Chinese spy balloon. So there are a lot of questions there, and at this point, we don't have a definitive answer.
Are there similar instances that have happened across the country at other military bases?
Yeah, there are, and we also presume that there may be some that we simply don't even know about, but there have been reports of others, for example, in Nevada, where there was a sensitive nuclear site that was a military base there that also had very similar situation to what we saw at Langley, which is this incursion of drones flying over our airspace. So again, the fact that this isn't just a one-off is also very concerning.
Now, federal law prohibits the military from shooting down drones near military bases unless they pose an imminent threat. But could we see lawmakers push for new laws to respond to these types of airspace incursions?
Yeah, Drew, that's a really good question. We don't have anything yet in the works. I've been told by a number of lawmakers, particularly in the House on the Oversight Committee, privately, that there should be some kind of legislation put forward, that there are some who have considered it that would allow for the military to potentially shoot these things down. But there are a lot of concerns about that. The reason the military doesn't do that now is for a couple of reasons. One is just safety of people who live on the base and nearby, that if you start shooting these things down, that could pose a risk. There was consideration of using other kinds of technology to shut those things down or maybe to jam their systems. But if you do that, that also may interfere with Wi-Fi potentially, with signals for emergency response. So it could create a ripple effect of other problems if the military responds in that way. So that certainly is a challenge that the U.S. military and the Air Force in particular are going to have to figure out, because otherwise what we have is a really bad situation where these things are over our airspace in sensitive places, leaving the military without a whole lot of options to respond in a way that they may otherwise would like to.
Thank you, News Nation's Joe Khalil. Kamala Harris is participating in a town hall event today with media personality Charlamagne the God. The event in Detroit, Michigan is part of Harris's outreach to black voters. Cate Martel, staff writer at The Hill, joins us to discuss. Cate, tell us more about this outreach and why the Harris campaign is making it a focus.
Yeah, Drew, it's a fascinating campaign strategy for the Harris campaign. She hasn't done many traditional media outlet appearances, but she's been appearing on, podcasts and, shows such as Charlamagne the God. She is absolutely targeting black voters, specifically black male voters, by doing an interview like this. And she's doing it in Detroit, Michigan. That is a key battleground state. Now, it's showing me a lot about her strategy by wanting to target these black male voters who she has been struggling to find energy and enthusiasm from. That's why we saw Democrats bring former President Obama on the campaign trail to have a message and speak to these voters. Obama had a fairly stern message actually on the campaign trail by saying, I don't see as much energy and enthusiasm from black male voters that I saw in my own campaigns, and is trying to bring some of that back. It's fascinating when you step back from this that yes, she is targeting these voters, but also this week she has an interview with Fox News where she's then targeting Republican centrist voters that she might be able to peel off. And she's also doing more of these unconventional media appearances. She was on the Call Her Daddy podcast with Alex Cooper. That is one of the most popular podcasts among women. That's a big demographic that she's trying to court, and we're starting to see her in the final stretch do a lot of these unconventional media appearances. They may not be the ones that we're used to for presidential candidates, but she's very much targeting certain demographics that she thinks can help her on election day, Drew.
Yeah, and along those same lines, there are reports that Harris is in talks with Joe Rogan to make an appearance on his show. What do we know about that, and why would the Harris camp see that as possibly an intriguing opportunity?
That is an intriguing opportunity because Joe Rogan's podcast is arguably the most popular podcast in the U.S., particularly among young men. Like we talked, the Democrats have actually been worried over the past few weeks based on a string of polls that Harris is actually losing support among male voters and are trying to pull back some of that support. By appearing on Joe Rogan's podcast would give her the potential to have a successful interview that might be able to help her there. We've also heard that former President Trump himself might also appear on Joe Rogan's podcast. And I think it's just an interesting sign of the times that we're now seeing these candidates find voters in more targeted, unique opportunities instead of what we're used to in debate settings. There's only one presidential debate this cycle, yet we're seeing a string of these media appearances such as Joe Rogan, who, they can pick a demographic that they very specifically want to court and are finding ways that they can reach them and have these specific interviews that might be on one or two topics and really dig in instead of this broad swath of policy areas.
Donald Trump is calling on Kamala Harris to take a cognitive test. It comes amid accusations from both candidates that the other is unfit for office. Cate, this question of mental fitness is becoming more of an issue, it seems like, in both campaigns.
Yeah, it sure does, Drew. This was obviously an issue earlier when President Biden was the top of Democrats' ticket. And I would argue the issue is almost moot at that point because both candidates were in their upper 70s and they could almost cancel themselves out. We have seen the Harris campaign really slammed Trump for not releasing his medical records. This past Saturday, Harris released her own medical records that showed she was in quote unquote excellent health. And now this is becoming such a big issue because, when you have these older candidates, there is this question of mental acuity, and are both candidates able to be fit for the job? And now that, Vice President Harris is 59 when Trump is 78, that's nearly a 20-year span. And, while this was almost a moot issue when it was Biden and Trump, now that it's Harris, that was a campaign issue that was very, very much a talking point for former President Trump on the campaign trail, criticizing President Biden. Now he's finding himself as the older one on the ticket, and I think that's bringing up some insecurities, and that's what's making this even more of a bigger issue in upcoming campaigns.
Billionaire investor and Kamala Harris supporter Mark Cuban says business leaders are worried about retribution and vengeance from Donald Trump if he were elected. Cuban says that's causing those business leaders to avoid criticizing Trump in public despite concerns over his plans for the economy. What's Cuban's point here?
Yeah, Cuban is pretty interesting to be talking about this. He is obviously a very successful businessman and a self-made billionaire, and he is supporting Vice President Harris. His point is that big business really favors stability, and he argues that former President Trump does not bring that stability. He pointed specifically to tariffs. That's something where you see these businesses having years to plan and would like a heads up on some of these major policy areas. And the way that Trump brings some of these issues up, it brings instability, and that's not necessarily good for business. And at the same time, Mark Cuban is also talking about this retribution and vengeance that he argues comes from former President Trump. Trump is known to hold a grudge, and that's why I think he's arguing you're not seeing many CEOs and many people in business outwardly attacking former President Trump because they are worried about this retribution. They are worried about the blowback because Trump is very active on social media. He's very active in his own policy areas, and they could potentially become the subject of something viral. And I think that's something that they're trying to avoid, in Mark Cuban's words.
All right. Well, I really appreciate your insight. Cate Martel, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Washington, D.C. is once again home to a pair of giant pandas. Check it out. Bao Lin and Qing Bao landed at Washington Dulles International Airport earlier this morning, heading for their new home at the Smithsonian's National Zoo. It comes less than a year after 3 giant pandas left the capital after the agreement between the Smithsonian and the China Wildlife Conservation Association ended. San Francisco and San Diego also have received pandas from China. The National Zoo wrote in a post on X this week that the zoo would be closed starting Tuesday for the safety of the pandas and the staff. It's not clear when visitors will be able to see the pandas. This is the moment North Korea blew up a section of road that once linked the country with South Korea. In a symbolic sign of anger, North Korea Tuesday bombed the northern sections of the unused roads and rail routes after exchanging threats with South Korea last week. The North said it would cut off inter-Korean roads and fortify the areas on its border to further push its agenda of a two-state system. The tensions between the two countries heightened after North Korea accused Seoul of flying drones over Pyongyang and scattering anti-North Korean leaflets. In response to the bombings, South Korea's military fired warning shots along the military demarcation line. Google is getting into the nuclear business. The tech giant signed a deal this week to build a fleet of small modular nuclear reactors to power its data centers. The reactors are a type of next-generation nuclear reactor that have not been built in the U.S. previously. It comes as Google and other tech firms are looking for ways to meet the energy demands of artificial intelligence. Construction is expected to be completed between 2030 and 2035. When completed, each will produce about 500 megawatts of power. Check your refrigerator. The Department of Agriculture has issued a massive recall of meat linked to a possible listeria outbreak. It's impacted hundreds of ready-to-eat meals at major grocery stores, including Walmart, Trader Joe's, and Target. The recall involves nearly 10 million pounds of pre-cooked meat and poultry items produced between June and October of this year. The affected products appeared in a variety of items from frozen dinners to pre-made salads. So far, there haven't been any reports of people getting sick, but the USDA says listeria infections can have serious or even fatal consequences. They say it's best to throw out items that you think might have been affected. For exact product numbers, check the USDA website or head over to thehill.com. All eyes are on the presidential election, but control of Congress is also on the ballot this November. And in the Senate, it could come down to just a few races. Connell McShane breaks down which seats could tip the balance of power in the upper chamber.
It's the fight for the Senate. I'm Connell McShane from News Nation, and right now the Democratic caucus controls the Senate with a razor-thin margin. There are 34 seats up for grabs in November. 23 are held by Democrats or independents, so that means Republicans only have to pick up 2, and they take control. Now, you look at the data from Decision Desk HQ, it says Montana and West Virginia are the seats most likely to flip Democrat to Republican. And Democrats are also defending in 4 of the 6 closest Senate races. That includes Ohio, where the incumbent Sherrod Brown has a 58% chance of keeping his job. In Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, the Democrats also have tough fights. Now, Republicans, meantime, are on defense in Florida and in Texas with Rick Scott and Ted Cruz. But big picture, Decision Desk HQ gives the Republicans a more than 70% chance of controlling the Senate. I'm Connell McShane. This is the News Nation Political Minute.
And that's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.